Somewhere in the years you spent inside a classroom, you learned about the water cycle, the causes of a war from 3 centuries ago, and how to calculate the area of a triangle. You can probably still recall fragments of all 3. What you were never taught is how money actually moves, how it is created, how it compounds in the hands of people who understand its older logic, how it drains, quietly and permanently, from the hands of people who do not. That absence is not an accident. This is the part most financial books will not say directly. They will tell you to budget better, save more, invest earlier. Good advice. Incomplete advice. None of it explains why the rules you were handed from childhood were never designed to make you wealthy. They were designed to make you useful, productive in a specific, bounded way, reliable, employable. There is a difference between those 2 destinations. The distance between them is measured in decades of unearned income. Here is what very few people know. The principles that actually govern wealth creation are not modern. They are not new discoveries from Silicon Valley or Wall Street. They are older than economics as a discipline, older than the institutions that now decide what gets taught and what disappears. These principles existed, worked, and built lasting material lives long before anyone had an interest in removing them from public knowledge. They were removed anyway. What you are about to hear was not written to comfort you. It was written because the code still works. It has always worked, and you have never been given a clean look at it until right now. Chapter 1. Everything they taught you was designed to shrink you. There is a pattern that runs through every civilization that has ever risen and fallen. In every era, in every corner of the world, there existed a body of knowledge about money, value, and human potential that the powerful kept close and rarely shared. This knowledge was not magic. It was not luck. It was a set of principles, older than any economy, older than any government, that allowed ordinary people to build extraordinary lives. Here is the part that should stop you cold. That knowledge was not taken from you by accident. You are living inside a system built, deliberately and precisely, to ensure you would never find it. Not because you were unworthy, because you were too valuable as someone who did not know. What changed for you when you stepped into a classroom for the first time is not what you were told it would be. You were told you were being prepared. You will hear a different story now. Picture where you were 3 years ago, not in terms of your income or your address, in terms of what you believed was possible for you financially. Were you waiting for something to click? Were you following all the advice, spend less, save more, work harder, and still feeling like the finish line kept moving? That feeling has a name. The name is not laziness. The name is not bad luck. The name is design. In the late 1800s, as factories multiplied across industrialized nations, and the demand for reliable, punctual, obedient workers exploded, a quiet but consequential decision was made by those who funded and shaped mass education. The decision was not written as a confession. It was written as a mission statement. The goal of compulsory schooling, as discussed among its earliest architects, was not to cultivate independent thinkers or self-directed builders of wealth. It was to produce a predictable human output, someone who could follow instructions, report on time, stay in their lane, and accept wages without asking too many uncomfortable questions. Read that again slowly in your mind. Not to produce thinkers, to produce workers. Here is where the story gets precise. Precision is the thing that separates an uncomfortable truth from a conspiracy theory. Financial literacy, the basic understanding of how money moves, how interest compounds, how assets differ from liabilities, how wealth actually accumulates over generations, was not forgotten from the curriculum. There is no evidence of a meeting where someone said, "Leave this out." What there is evidence of is something quieter and more lasting. There was simply never any intention to put it in. The open loop is this. If not the school, then where did the knowledge go? Where was it kept? You will have that answer before this chapter ends, and it will change how you read everything that follows. Let a woman named 𝗓𝗧𝗧𝗘 hold this principle for a moment. Clara grew up in a mid-sized industrial city, the daughter of a man who worked in a processing plant for 31 years. Her father was not a stupid man. He was a man who had been educated inside the same system you were, trained to value security over understanding, to prize the steady paycheck over the question of why the paycheck stayed small. Clara graduated with honors. She was told she was one of the good ones. She studied hard, moved into an entry-level role at a logistics company, and spent 4 years doing exactly what she had been taught to do. She budgeted. She saved small amounts. She opened a retirement account because someone on a podcast said to. And at 27, she sat at her kitchen table on a Tuesday night with a calculator and a growing sense that something was structurally wrong with the math of her life. She was doing everything right, and somehow she was still stationary. What Clara understood that night was not a trick, not a secret product, not a better app. What she understood was that she had been handed an incomplete map, and no amount of effort spent following an incomplete map will get you to the right destination. Here is the thing about an incomplete map. You do not feel the incompleteness while you are moving. You only feel it when the terrain stops matching the promise. The terrain and the promise stopped matching for you at some point. You would not be here if they had not. So what exactly was left off the map? This is where the chapter earns its title. Schools were not designed with malice toward you personally. The architects of compulsory education were solving a real problem. They needed a scalable way to civilize a rapidly industrializing population, to get children off the streets and into rooms where they could learn to read and count and sit still. Those are not nothing. But the priorities that shaped what got taught and what got left out were not your priorities. They were the priorities of the economy that needed to absorb you, an economy that needed you to be productive, not powerful, disciplined, not discerning, employable, not entrepreneurial. What was buried in that transaction was ancient. The principles of building wealth are not modern. They did not originate with hedge funds or stock markets or any institution that requires you to trust someone else with your money. The principles go further back than that, much further. In the records of ancient trade economies, in the oral traditions of merchant families across cultures, in the private letters and ledgers of those who built lasting financial lives across centuries, you find the same architecture repeating. The same understanding of how value is created, stored, transferred, and grown. The map was old when economics was young, and when compulsory education systems were built for scale, that old map was not included in the curriculum, not because it was false, because it was for people who were building, not people who were working. What was buried still works. This is the revelation the chapter has been moving toward. It deserves a plain sentence and nothing more. The principles that were excluded from your education are not outdated. They are not the province of the wealthy by nature. They are accessible, they are learnable, and they have been waiting in the silence between everything you were taught. The map they burned not with fire but with omission is still readable. The ink did not fade. The territory it describes has not changed. Now think about your own life for a moment. Think about the adults who raised you. Not what they said about money, but what they did. Did they know, in explicit terms, the difference between an asset and a liability? Did anyone ever explain to them how money compounds in one direction when you save it and in another direction when you owe it? Did anyone hand them a working model of how wealth moves and why it stays with some people and not others? Or did they do what most people do? Repeat the financial behavior of the people who raised them, because that was the only curriculum they were ever given. This is not blame, this is inheritance. You inherited a broken curriculum, and what you inherit, you can also refuse. The knowledge stripped from the education system did not disappear entirely. It survived in fragments, in the practices of small business families who passed down rules about money across generations, in the private reading of self-made individuals who stumbled onto older texts, in the hands of traders and craftsmen and careful household managers across history who never needed an institution to tell them what the institution was hiding. A little later, we will get to a point about where wealth originates that runs straight against the usual belief. Once that lands, it shifts how you act, not just how you think. But right now, the most important thing to absorb is this. The reason you feel behind is not because you failed. The reason you feel behind is because the starting gun was fired in a race you were not told you were running. You were handed a different instruction set. You were told to be good at your job, to follow the rules, to trust the system. And the system, for all its uses, was never designed to make you wealthy. It was designed to make you useful. There is a difference between useful and free. You already sensed it. That is why you are here. The open loop closes with this. The knowledge left out of your education did not vanish. It was preserved as the most durable knowledge always is in the oldest human containers available in story, in principle, in pattern. In the chapters ahead, you will find it piece by piece, not as theory, as instruction, as something you can actually use starting now. Every system has a seam. The question is not whether the seam exists. The question is whether you are ready to find it. Chapter 2. The wealthy have always used a different curriculum. You already know how to work hard. That is not the problem. Almost everyone you know works hard. Your parents worked hard. Your teachers worked hard. The people at every job you have ever held worked hard. And yet the gap between those who build lasting wealth and those who spend their lives chasing it keeps widening, year after year, with almost mechanical precision. Here is what most people believe about that gap. They believe it comes down to income. Earn more, close the gap. They believe it is a math problem. Spend less, save the difference. Nearly every financial article, every budgeting app, every well-meaning piece of advice handed down in schools and households operates on that same assumption. That assumption is wrong, not partially wrong, structurally, deliberately, historically wrong. The real gap was never about what you earned. It was about what you were taught, and what was quietly withheld from you was not an accident. By the end of this chapter, you will see exactly where the two curriculums split, and you will never look at a classroom the same way again. Think about the question the previous chapter left with you, whether you are ready to find the seam. That question was not rhetorical. Finding the seam requires something specific. It requires a map. And the map that would show you where wealth actually comes from, how it is created, how it is kept, how it compounds across generations. That map has not disappeared. It has simply been held by a very small number of people who had strong reasons to keep it close. Here is the open question this chapter will carry. Who decided what you learned in school about money and why? Hold that question. The answer is coming. But first, you need to see how far back this separation goes. Centuries before the modern school system existed, wealthy merchant families in Florence, in Venice, in the trading cities of the Hanseatic League, were running a parallel education for their children. Not the education of the public square or the church school, a private one. Sons of the great banking houses, the Bardis, the Peruzzis, the Medicis, were not simply taught reading and Latin. They were apprenticed, from early childhood, into the mechanics of ownership. They learned how to read a ledger not as an accounting exercise, but as a living picture of where power was moving in the world. They learned how credit worked, not to borrow it, but to extend it, and in doing so to own the labor of those who borrowed. They learned how land, cargo rights, and contract law could be structured so that wealth reproduced itself while the owner slept. That was the curriculum, and it was not written down in any public text. Now consider what the children of laborers, tradesmen, and even minor merchants were learning during the same period. They were learning their trade. They were learning how to do a thing, how to cut stone, cast metal, move goods from one port to another. Skill, execution, the ability to produce value for someone else. That contrast, owner education versus executor education, is not a medieval artifact. It is the architecture that got formalized, scaled, and eventually handed to governments as a model when mass schooling was invented. 𝗜𝗢𝗧 is a name worth knowing. Not famous, not historical in any textbook sense. He was a textile merchant in 17th century Antwerp, and he kept meticulous private journals that historians uncovered in a municipal archive 3 centuries later. In those journals, 𝗜𝗢𝗧 wrote about the specific lessons he gave his 2 sons and deliberately withheld from the apprentices who worked in his warehouses. His sons learned contract structure. They learned how to negotiate terms that compounded in their favor over time. They learned that the same bolt of cloth could be priced 3 different ways depending on who was paying, and that the difference between those prices was not dishonesty, it was leverage. His apprentices learned how to handle the cloth. They were paid fairly by the standards of their era. They worked hard. Some of them saved modestly. None of them ever owned a warehouse. 𝗜𝗢𝗧 wrote one line in his journal that stayed with the historians who found it. He wrote simply that a man who knows only how to make a thing will always need a man who knows how to own it. That one line is not cruelty. It is diagnosis, and it is still operating today in every economy on earth. Look back at the person you were before these last 3 years unfolded and look at it plainly. What you knew about money, interest, contracts, the mechanics of ownership. Now think about what you were never directly taught, not how to earn, but how to structure. Not how to save, but how to position what you save so it pulls more toward it. If there is a gap between those 2 columns of knowledge, it was not your failure to pay attention in school. The school simply did not cover those columns. It was not designed to. That is not a conspiracy theory. It is history with a paper trail. When Prussia formalized mass public education in the early 19th century, a model that spread rapidly to Britain, the United States, and eventually most of the industrialized world, the architects of those systems were explicit about their goals. They wanted to produce citizens who were disciplined, punctual, literate enough to follow instructions, and oriented toward steady employment. They said this in official government documents, not in secret, publicly. The school was designed to produce a worker, a reliable, capable, compliant worker. And for the industrial economy then exploding across Europe and North America, that was exactly what was needed. What the industrialists needed were workers. What they themselves practiced and taught their own children privately was something else entirely. The map they removed was not taken out of spite. It was removed from the public curriculum because keeping it public would have undermined the entire supply chain of human effort that the new economy required. Why teach a child how to own a machine when you need that child to operate it for the next 40 years? This is not ancient history. This is the architecture your schooling was built inside. Here is the moment where most people feel something uncomfortable. The instinct is to get angry, to feel cheated. And that instinct is not wrong, but anger aimed at the wrong target is just exhaustion in disguise. The useful response is not anger. The useful response is clarity about what was missing, followed by a deliberate decision to learn it now. And here is the hope in all of this. The curriculum that was withheld is not lost. It was never destroyed. It was kept private, passed down through families and private institutions and closed circles, but it was kept intact. The principles that merchant families in Florence used to build multi-generational wealth are the same principles at work in every functioning private equity structure today. The principles that the Hanseatic traders used to turn contracts into compounding advantages are the same principles behind every franchise model and intellectual property agreement you have ever encountered. These ideas are older than economics as a formal discipline. They predate every financial system that currently exists. They were working before the word capitalism was ever written down. What was buried still works. The soil did not change. The seed did not rot. It simply was not handed to you. Now go back to the question this chapter opened with. Who decided what you learned about money in school and why? The answer is, the people who built the school had a specific product in mind. And the product was not a wealth creator. The product was a productive, educated employee who would show up, add value to someone else's structure, and receive a portion of that value as a wage. The system was not broken. It was performing exactly as designed. The problem is that you were handed someone else's design without being told it was designed for someone else's benefit. That is the information gap. That is the real distance between the two groups you have always sensed existed, the ones who seem to move with the current and the ones who swim against it their whole lives. It is not intelligence. It is not work ethic. It is one curriculum versus another. Further on, we will get to a point about where financial knowledge comes from that runs straight against the usual belief. When that becomes clear, it shifts the first financial decision you make after finishing this page. One curriculum produces owners, the other produces employees. You were handed one of them. The question now is what you do with the other. Chapter 3. Babylon understood compound growth before Rome fell. Saving money makes you poorer. Not eventually, not in some complicated theoretical scenario right now, in the way most people practice it. That sounds like advice from someone trying to empty your pockets. It is not. It is what the oldest surviving financial records in human history show, written on clay tablets before Rome was a city, before Greece had a philosophy, before the word economics existed in any language on earth. The people who inscribed these records understood something your school deliberately skipped, and the gap between what they knew and what you were taught is costing you years, possibly decades. The principle they recorded was precise. Money that sits is money that dies. Money that moves in a specific and disciplined way is money that multiplies without your presence. You have heard partial versions of this idea. What you have not heard is where it came from, how long it has worked, and why it is the one lesson that never appears on any official curriculum anywhere in the modern world. They handed you one map. This chapter is going to show you the older one. You were handed a curriculum. Maybe you followed it well. Maybe you studied hard, got decent grades, landed a job, opened a savings account. And somewhere around your mid-20s, you felt this quiet sense that the math was not adding up. That something in the sequence was wrong. You were doing what you were told. The gap between your effort and your financial position was not closing the way anyone implied it would. That feeling is not a personal failure. It is the correct response to a system that was not designed to move you forward. Here is the open question to carry with you through this chapter. If the rules of wealth are genuinely ancient and genuinely universal, why does almost no one seem to follow them? Hold that question. The answer is stranger and more specific than you think. Babylon sat at the center of the ancient world for roughly 1,500 years. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers created an agricultural surplus that nobody had seen before at that scale. With surplus came trade. With trade came debt. With debt came records. And the Babylonians, meticulous, practical, brilliantly mercantile, pressed those records into wet clay with reed styluses and baked them in the sun until they were permanent. Thousands of those tablets still exist. Some contain grain inventories, some describe legal disputes, and some, discovered by archaeologists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, describe the precise mechanics of personal wealth. George Clason studied these tablets. In 1926, he published what became known as The Richest Man in Babylon, a book that retold the financial principles from those sources as parables. Most people who have heard of that book remember one line: pay yourself first. 10% of everything you earn belongs to you. But Clason's book was a doorway, not the full room. The tablets he drew from were not motivational folklore. They were records of an actual educational system, one that Babylonian fathers and merchants used to instruct their sons in the mechanics of accumulation. The principles in those tablets fall into a small cluster of ideas, not 50 rules, not 100, 5 or 6 core observations about how money behaves, written as if they were laws of physics. In many ways they are. Return to the person you were before these last 3 years unfolded and look at it plainly. Where were you financially? Not emotionally, not professionally, financially. How much of what you earned in those 3 years did you keep? Not spend, not invest on advice you half understood, keep, as a deliberate, protected portion of your income that you controlled entirely. Most people, when they sit honestly with that question, find a number far smaller than they want it to be. That is not discipline. That is not laziness. That is the predictable result of a model that never taught you retention before it taught you consumption. The Babylonians called the principle by different names in different tablets, but the concept was identical across all of them. A fixed portion of your earnings must be held back from the moment it arrives. Not after your expenses, not after you see what is left at the end of the month. First, before anything else leaves your hand. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, a Babylonian scribe named Archad, or the figure Clason bases Archad upon, explained this to a young man using a metaphor that sounds almost too simple. A purse that never empties is a purse that is always fed. Here is where it gets deeper than Clason's version. The tablets do not stop at saving. The second principle is the one that changes everything. The portion you retain is not meant to sit. It is meant to work. The Babylonian concept of putting each coin to work was not metaphor. It was instruction. The scribes recorded specific examples of how a craftsman would take his retained earnings and lend them at interest to a merchant making a trade journey. The merchant returns, the craftsman collects his portion of the gain, and that gain goes back into the next loan. This is compound growth, not as a modern financial product, not as an investment account, as a 5,000-year-old principle that those scribes considered so obvious it needed almost no justification. They were more surprised by the man who hoarded and did nothing than by the man who deployed and multiplied. Rome, for all its engineering brilliance, never systematized this the way Babylon did. Rome accumulated through conquest. Babylon accumulated through commerce. One model required armies. The other required only discipline and a basic understanding of how time multiplies deployed capital. When Rome fell, the army model collapsed with it. What the Babylonian tablets described was already older than Rome by 1,000 years, and it did not stop working when Rome went silent. Consider a man named 𝗡𝗧. He was a sandal maker in a city on the western edge of the Babylonian trade routes, around the 7th century before the Common Era. 𝗡𝗧 was not poor, but he was not prospering either. He worked long days, made a fair sandal, sold at a fair price, and every season found himself in almost the same position as the season before. A merchant named 𝗜𝗠, who passed through the city twice yearly, noticed this and asked 𝗡𝗧 a simple question. He said, "Of the 10 coins you earn each week, how many do you keep?" 𝗡𝗧 said he kept what was left, which some weeks was 1 coin and some weeks was none. 𝗜𝗠 told him to keep 1 coin first before anything else and to bring those coins to him at the next visit, not as a gift, as a stake in 𝗜𝗠's next trade. 𝗡𝗧 agreed. 6 months later, 𝗜𝗠 returned and gave 𝗡𝗧 his 1/12th share of the journey's profit. It was not a fortune, but it was money 𝗡𝗧 had not worked for directly. He set it beside his retained coins, and on 𝗜𝗠's next visit he had more to stake. 3 years later, 𝗡𝗧 was not just a sandal maker. He was a partial investor in 8 trade routes, and the coins arriving from those routes were beginning to outpace the coins arriving from his own bench. Nothing in that story required extraordinary talent. Nothing required connections 𝗡𝗧 was born with. It required one discipline practiced without exception, and one decision to make retained money active rather than inert. That is the thing sitting in those clay tablets that your school never mentioned. Not the saving, the activation. The modern financial system is very comfortable teaching you to save. Banks need your savings. They need the deposits. What they do not teach you is what they do with those deposits. They deploy them at multiples, using the same principle Babylon described on clay. The bank is 𝗜𝗠. You are currently 𝗡𝗧 before the conversation. The system was designed so that you remain the source of the capital and someone else remains the deployer of it. Not because you are incapable of deploying it yourself, because you were never taught that you were supposed to. This is not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It does not require shadowy meetings or coordinated malice. It requires only that the curriculum produced compliant workers at such scale, and that the owners of capital found it so perpetually useful that the curriculum calcified. Generation after generation learned to work for income and save in institutions, while the institutions quietly operated on 5,000-year-old Babylonian principles that were available to anyone who asked the right questions. What was buried still works. That is the thing about principles that old. They are not dated by time. They are only blocked by ignorance of their existence. Soon, we will get to a point about the relationship between risk and wealth that runs straight against the usual belief. After that clicks, It shifts how you decide where your money goes and why. But right now, in this chapter, the revelation is simpler and heavier than any tactic. The core laws of wealth accumulation are over 4,000 years old. They have not changed. They work in any currency, in any market, in any economic climate, with any income level above pure subsistence. They were not discovered by Wall Street. They were not invented by hedge fund managers or Ivy League economists. They were pressed into wet clay by tradespeople and merchants who had no formal education but had sharp eyes and long memories and the wisdom to write down what they observed. Here is where the open question from earlier closes. Why does almost no one follow these principles if they are genuinely universal and genuinely ancient? Because the map was burned. Not literally in most cases. Metaphorically. Systematically. Through the simple omission of a few foundational ideas from an educational structure that touched nearly every person alive in the modern world. You do not miss a map you never knew existed. You just wander, and wonder why you keep arriving at the same place. You know the map exists now. The question is no longer whether these principles work. They have been working for 4,000 years without your permission or your awareness. The question is how long you are willing to let them work for someone else. Chapter 4. The law of value creation predates currency. Something is steadily bleeding out of your days while you stay busy. Not loudly. Not in one catastrophic moment you could point to and explain. Quietly, invisibly, in the space between what you earn and what you could be earning, between what you produce and what that production is actually worth. Every week you spend working inside a system that never taught you how value actually moves, that is not a neutral week. It is a compounding cost. The money you are not yet attracting is not just this month's difference. It is the resource that would have created options, bought time, opened doors, and it is slipping by, not because you are failing, because you were handed a map that left out the most important roads. This chapter is about the roads they left out. Specifically, it is about a principle so old it was operating centuries before the first coin was ever minted. Once you see how it works, you will not be able to unsee it. The previous chapter closed with a question. Whether these principles work was never in doubt. They have been working for 4,000 years without your permission or your awareness. The only question left was how long you were willing to let them work for someone else. Here is the answer that question was pointing toward. There is a man worth meeting. His name was 𝗓𝗠𝗧. He was a Phoenician merchant operating out of the city of Tyre around 900 BCE. He understood something about wealth that most people living today have never been taught, not in school, not in any financial advice column, not in any online course promising passive income. 𝗓𝗠𝗧 did not think about money. He thought about problems. He woke up every morning asking one question. What does someone near me need that they cannot easily get for themselves? That question, asked every day for decades, made him one of the most resource-rich men in the ancient Mediterranean world. The money was never the target. The value was the target. The money was simply what appeared when the value arrived. Notice what just happened there. Hold that. 𝗓𝗠𝗧's specific genius was in cedar wood. Tyre sat on the coast, surrounded by the famous cedars of Lebanon, and the rest of the ancient world was building ships, temples, and palaces that desperately required exactly that wood. Egypt needed it. Cyprus needed it. The emerging cities of Greece needed it. 𝗓𝗠𝗧 did not simply sell lumber. He organized the cutting, the curing, the transport, and the delivery across open sea. He was solving 5 separate logistical problems that his buyers had no capacity to solve themselves. He was not just moving wood. He was removing a massive obstacle from the path of people who had resources and ambition, but lacked the specific thing he could provide. By the time 𝗓𝗠𝗧 was 50 years old, his warehouses held grain from Egypt, copper from Cyprus, dyed cloth worth more per bolt than most craftsmen earned in a season, and agreements, what we would today call contracts, with rulers and merchants across 4 different regions. He did not hoard. He kept resources circulating. He understood that resources accumulate around the people who generate the most movement for others. Picture the person you were before these last 3 years unfolded and look at it plainly. Not in dramatic terms, just practically. 3 years ago, what problems were you solving for other people? Not for yourself, for others. Were those problems large or small? Were they rare problems that few others could solve, or common ones that anyone with time could handle? Because right now, in your life, the size of the problems you solve and the number of people those solutions reach is almost certainly the exact ceiling on your financial life. Not your education level, not your background, not the economy, the scale of the problem you are solving. This is the principle 𝗓𝗠𝗧 knew, and it is older than any economic theory you have ever studied. Here is the open question this chapter is sitting with, and it will be answered before the final paragraph. If this principle is so old, so durable, so consistently demonstrated across 4,000 years of human civilization, why does almost no one who teaches money and success ever mention it this directly? Why is it framed, when it is mentioned at all, as motivational language rather than as a mechanical law? That answer matters more than the principle itself. But first, the principle needs to land completely. Wealth does not flow toward need. Wealth flows toward solution. This seems obvious when you say it, but most people live as though the opposite were true. Most people approach money from the receiving end. They think about what they require, what they deserve, what the market should be paying them. That thinking is not wrong exactly. It is just facing the wrong direction. 𝗓𝗠𝗧 faced outward. Every resource calculation he made began with what others needed, not what he wanted. The inward-facing version of financial thinking is what the modern system teaches. It teaches you to optimize your resume, to negotiate your salary, to save a percentage of what someone else decided you were worth. All of that is management of crumbs. None of it is the law. The law is this: whoever creates the most value for the most people accumulates the most resources, not eventually, not as a reward, as a direct mechanical consequence. Value creation and resource accumulation are not 2 separate things connected by good fortune. They are the same process described from 2 different angles. This is what was buried. This is what the map they burned would have shown you at 20 years old instead of at whatever age you are hearing this now. Here is where the modern system made its most elegant and damaging substitution. It replaced the question of value creation with the question of credential acquisition. Instead of teaching you to ask what large problem you could solve and for how many people, it taught you to ask what certificate would make you employable. Employability is not the same thing as value creation. Employability is about meeting someone else's definition of usefulness. Value creation is about identifying what people genuinely need and building your entire capacity around delivering it better than anyone else currently can. These 2 paths begin in the same place, a young person trying to build a life, but they arrive in completely different locations. A credential tells the market you have completed a standardized process. Value creation tells the market you can solve a specific problem they actually have. One of these things commands a wage. The other commands a price you largely set yourself. The Phoenicians did not have business schools. They did not have financial advisors or investment platforms or savings accounts with interest rates. What they had was a clear-eyed, daily practice of asking which problems in their world were both urgent and poorly solved, and then positioning themselves precisely at that intersection. Hanno was not smarter than his competition in any abstract sense. He was more precisely focused on what others needed. That focus, sustained over years, produced results that looked from the outside like extraordinary luck or mysterious advantage. It was neither. It was the law working exactly as it always does. You have encountered this law before, by the way, not in these words, but you have watched it operate. You have seen someone you know, not famous, not particularly well connected, build something genuinely useful, and then watched the money follow. You probably explained it to yourself as timing or personality or a network they were lucky enough to have. Some of those things were real, but underneath all of them was the same mechanism. They were solving a real problem for real people at a meaningful scale. The money was the echo of that, not the cause. Now close the loop. The open question was why this principle, durable, ancient, mechanical, demonstrated across millennia, is almost never taught directly in the places that claim to teach money and success. The answer is straightforward once you see it. Teaching credential acquisition produces workers. Workers are the fundamental unit of the modern economic engine. A workforce of people trained to seek employment, to compete for wages, to measure their worth by what an employer assigns them. This is an engine that runs. It runs predictably. It produces economic output that flows by design toward the people who own the systems, not the people operating within them. This is not a conspiracy. It is just incentive architecture. The people who designed public education in its current form needed productive, employable citizens. They did not need a population of value creators asking what problems they could own and solve at scale. Value creators are harder to manage, harder to retain, harder to extract consistent output from. They have options. So the principle was not destroyed. It was not hidden in a vault. It was simply not included. It was left off the curriculum the way a map might leave off a road that leads to the only exit from a city. The road still exists. It still works. You simply were not shown it. Later on, we will get to a point about how risk and safety relate to wealth that runs straight against the usual belief. Once you grasp that turn, it shifts how you decide what to do next. For now, sit with this. Hanno built his entire life not around what he could accumulate, but around what he could solve. The accumulation was the consequence, not the intention. This sequencing, solution first, resource second, is not just ancient wisdom dressed in inspirational language. It is a description of how the mechanism actually operates. Change the sequence and you change the result. Most people have the sequence backward. Most people are waiting to have enough resources before they start creating serious value. Hanno started with the problem and let the resources arrive as proof that the problem was real. The question that will open the next chapter is this. If the scale of the problem you solve determines the ceiling on your financial life, how do you deliberately find bigger problems? And what makes some people instinctively better at seeing them than others? Chapter 5. Ancient traders knew the secret modern investors forgot. Saving money is not how wealth is built. You have heard the opposite your entire life, so that sentence probably landed wrong, but stay with it. The ancient merchants who built the first great trading networks across the Silk Road, the spice routes of Arabia, the grain corridors of Mesopotamia, they did not accumulate wealth by hoarding. They built it by first, deliberately, systematically, protecting against losing everything. That was the code, not the upside, the downside first. And somewhere between their world and yours, that principle was quietly removed from every conversation about money you were ever invited to have. The question that closed the last chapter was about scale, about how the size of the problem you solve sets the ceiling on your financial life. That is a real and important question. But here is what most people do when they start thinking bigger. They reach for more risk. They hear bigger reward, and they assume bigger exposure. The ancient traders would have called that confusion. They had a different equation entirely. Here is the open loop you should hold in your mind right now. Why did the wealthiest trading networks in human history almost never produce a single dominant investor who carried the full weight of a venture alone? It seems like a question about cooperation. It is actually a question about math. Come back to it. The answer will arrive, and when it does, it will reframe something you thought you already understood about money. Think about what a caravan actually was, not the romantic image of camels and desert dunes. Think about the financial structure underneath the movement. A merchant in 12th century Persia who wanted to send goods from Isfahan to Samarkand was not simply packing cargo and hoping for the best. He was entering a calculated agreement with other merchants. They pooled fractional ownership of multiple separate caravans heading in multiple separate directions, so that no single loss could eliminate him. Each merchant owned pieces of many ventures simultaneously. Each piece was small enough that its failure was survivable. But the collective exposure to upside was enormous. That is not diversification in the modern portfolio theory sense. It is something more deliberate than that. Modern diversification says, spread your money across many assets so that when one falls, the others cushion the drop. Ancient risk pooling said something different. It said, structure the venture so that total loss is mathematically impossible before you take one step. The caravan merchants were not reacting to loss after it happened. They were designing loss out of the equation in advance. The floor came before the ceiling. The protection came before the pursuit. Consider a man named 𝗓𝗠𝗄. He was a textile merchant operating out of Alexandria in the early 13th century. 𝗓𝗠𝗄 had watched his father lose an entire year's income on a single spice shipment raided 3 days outside the city. One venture, one failure, 1 year gone. 𝗓𝗠𝗄 decided he would never allow a single decision to carry that weight again. When he took his first independent trade, he approached 6 other merchants in his quarter and proposed a structure that was already centuries old by the time he used it. Each of them contributed a portion of capital to a shared pool. That pool was then divided across 4 separate caravans, carrying different goods, traveling different routes to different destination markets. 𝗓𝗠𝗄's personal stake in any single caravan was 1/6 of 1/4. A raid, a flood, a corrupt official seizing cargo, any one disaster could claim at most 1/24 of his total exposure. In a single year, he watched 2 of the 4 caravans encounter serious problems. He still finished the year with a meaningful gain. Not because he was lucky, because the structure he built made catastrophe local instead of total. The wealth he accumulated over the following decade was not the product of bold individual bets. It was the product of a system that made survival the base case and profit the upside. Now ask yourself something honestly. Think about the last financial decision you made or watched someone close to you make. Where was the first thought? Was it on the return on what could be gained? Or was it on the floor on the worst case, and whether that worst case was survivable? Most people raised in the modern financial conversation were taught to think about returns first. Risk was the asterisk. Risk was the small print. Risk was what advisors mentioned briefly before showing you the projections. The ancient model inverted this sequence completely. Risk was the first sentence. Risk was the blueprint. Profit was what remained after the blueprint was honored. Here is why that matters more now than it did 50 years ago. The modern financial system was not designed to teach you how to build lasting wealth. It was designed to channel your money into instruments that primarily serve the institutions holding those instruments. The retirement account, the index fund, the diversified portfolio. These are not bad tools, but they were not handed to you in the spirit of the caravan merchant. They were handed to you as a substitute for thinking, a managed, packaged, professionally branded substitute for the kind of structural thinking that 𝗓𝗠𝗣 and the merchants of Isfahan practiced as a matter of daily survival. As this book keeps moving, we will get to a point about financial risk that runs straight against the usual belief. When that point settles, it shifts how you actually decide whether to move on an opportunity. But right now, sit with this. The modern investment system calls its approach sophisticated. It uses mathematics that would have seemed incomprehensible to a 12th century merchant. And yet the 12th century merchant had something the modern system quietly discarded. He had skin in the game at every level. He personally felt the structure of every agreement. He could not outsource the thinking without also outsourcing the outcome. His protection was not a product someone sold him. It was a design he built himself before he committed a single coin. Sophistication, it turns out, can be another word for distance. Distance from the mechanics of the decision. Distance from the real cost of being wrong. The ancient traders were not sophisticated in the modern sense. They were precise. There is a difference. Here is something almost no one says out loud about investing. The most dangerous moment in any financial venture is not when the market drops. It is the moment you commit more than you can survive losing. After that moment, your decision-making changes. You stop thinking about the best outcome. You start thinking about rescue. The mind that is trying to rescue itself makes different choices than the mind operating from a position of designed security. The caravan merchants understood this not as psychology but as commerce. A merchant operating in fear of total loss was unreliable. He would make desperate trades. He would accept bad terms. He would exit positions at the worst possible time. So the structure itself was designed to prevent him from ever entering that psychological state. They were managing the decision-maker, not just the decision. This is the insight that has been buried. Not in a conspiracy, not in a room somewhere with men deciding what you should and should not know. Buried the way most useful things get buried slowly, under the weight of what is more profitable for someone else to teach you. The map they burned was not made of paper. It was made of practice, oral transmission. The understanding that passed between generations of merchants who knew that the first rule of building wealth across a lifetime is that you must still be in the game to receive what the game eventually offers. You cannot receive a reward from a game you have already been eliminated from. Now close the loop. Remember the question from earlier. Why did the wealthiest trading networks in human history almost never produce a single dominant investor who carried the full weight of a venture alone? The answer is not that they lacked ambition. The answer is that carrying the full weight alone was understood to be structurally irrational. Not cowardly, not unambitious, irrational. One person bearing all the downside on a single venture was considered evidence of poor planning, not bold vision. The merchants who lasted, the ones whose families built wealth across generations, were the ones who treated the distribution of risk as a form of intelligence, not a dilution of reward. Modern financial culture quietly reversed this. It celebrated the lone bet, the all-in move, the visionary who mortgaged everything on a single idea. These stories get told because they make good stories. They do not get told because they represent a reliable method. For every story you heard about the person who risked everything and won, there are 50 people who risked everything and disappeared quietly into financial damage that lasted decades. You did not hear their stories because disappearance does not attract an audience. The ancient code is older than economics. It is older than the word investment. It is the recognition that the first act of wealth building is designing your own survival. Not as timidity, as the precondition for everything else. The merchants who built routes connecting continents were not cautious people. They moved through deserts and across open seas and through territories governed by men who could seize their goods without consequence. They were not timid. They were structured. And their structure allowed them to be bold without being fragile. That distinction, bold without fragile, is what was buried, and it is what you are now holding. Protecting against total loss was not the enemy of ambition in the ancient world. It was the foundation ambition was built on. Modern speculation inverted this and called the inversion sophistication. But sophistication that produces fragility is not a step forward. It is the map, redrawn, with the most important roads removed. The question for the next chapter is this. Once you have built the floor, once total loss is no longer the outcome of a single bad decision, what do you do with the space that creates? And why do most people, even after they understand risk, still hesitate to move? Chapter 6. The tithe was never about religion. Something is draining out of your life right now, and it has no name you were ever given. Not debt, not overspending, not bad luck. Something older and quieter than any of those. Every week you earn, and every week nearly all of it moves. Into rent, into groceries, into the invisible obligations that modern life stacks on top of you before you even open your eyes on Monday morning. What remains, if anything remains, feels like a reward. You protect it. You hold it. You wait for the right moment to do something with it. And while you wait, it shrinks. The cost of waiting is not dramatic. It is not a single catastrophic event. It is the compounding of ordinary days, each one slightly smaller than it could have been. Each one quietly subtracting from a future you can still see but seem unable to close the distance to. There is a mechanism behind this. It is not your discipline. It is not your income. It is the order in which you have been taught to move money. That order was chosen for you long before you were born by people who needed something specific from you. Here is the open question for this chapter. Why did every major civilization on Earth, separated by oceans, by language, by centuries, arrive independently at the same exact practice? Not approximately the same. Exactly. A fixed percentage given first before anything else moved. Hold that question. The answer is not what you have been told, and it will change how you think about something you do every single day. Most people hear the word tithe and immediately place it inside a church. That is where the modern world stored it. But the practice is older than any church, older than the Bible's codification of it, older than the temple systems of the ancient Near East that formalized it, older than the Sanskrit records that describe near-identical customs in the Vedic tradition. The word itself comes from a root meaning 1/10. And the practice of separating 1/10 first, before consumption, before saving, before any other financial motion, appears in merchant records from Phoenicia that predate the oldest religious texts referencing it by more than 400 years. 400 years. It was not invented by religion. It was borrowed by religion, Because religion recognized something that worked. You have to sit with that for a moment. Every tradition that touched human beings for long enough ended up encoding this specific behavior. Not a vague instruction to be generous. Not a suggestion to give when comfortable. A fixed percentage. First. Non-negotiable. That precision is the signal. When something imprecise gets borrowed across cultures, it blurs. When something precise gets borrowed across cultures unchanged, it means the precision itself is doing the work. Here is where a man named Hanno enters this story. Hanno was a Phoenician merchant, active in the waters between Carthage and the southern coast of what we now call Spain, sometime in the 6th century before the Common Era. His records, fragments preserved through secondary sources, the kind of accounting that survived not because anyone valued it spiritually, but because it was practical, show a single consistent behavior across 43 years of trade. Before any cargo was valued, before any profit was calculated, before any crew was paid, Hanno separated 1/10 of every return and designated it forward, not to a god, though he named gods in the margins. Not to a temple, though he made those payments too. He separated it as a structural act. His own notes describe it as the amount that belongs to the next voyage before this one is finished. The amount that belongs to the next voyage before this one is finished. He was not being religious in that moment. He was being mechanical. He was building a floor under future decisions before present comfort could erode it. And in 43 years of trade across some of the most dangerous commercial waters in the ancient world, Hanno never once, in the surviving record, failed to fund the next voyage. Let that land without explanation for just a moment. Now think about where you are right now. Think about what the past 3 years have looked like financially. Not the disasters, not the peaks, the ordinary texture of it. The way money arrives. The way it leaves. Think about whether in any of those months you moved a fixed percentage of what came in before you touched the rest, before rent, before food, before any of it. If you are like most people living inside the modern financial system, the answer is no. Not because you are careless, because nobody showed you this was the first move. They showed you earning. They showed you spending within your means. They showed you saving what is left. That sequence, earn, spend, save what remains, is the sequence that produces exactly what you are currently experiencing. The sequence that Hanno used was different by one crucial move. The sequence that appears in the Talmudic economic texts, in the laws of Manu, in the merchant codes of Tang Dynasty China, in the records of pre-colonial West African trading societies, all of it different by one crucial move. Give first, not save first. Give first. This distinction matters more than anything else in this chapter. When you save first, you are still operating inside a scarcity logic. You are protecting resources. You are defending against loss. The psychological posture of saving is preservation. It is hands cupped around a flame. That is not a criticism. Preservation has its place, but it is not the posture that generates momentum. And the people who wrote the ancient merchant codes knew this from direct observation, not theory. They watched what happened to merchants who hoarded versus merchants who gave first. The pattern was consistent enough to become law. Giving a fixed percentage first does something that saving does not do. It trains the operating assumption of your financial mind. Every time you give before you consume, you are making a declaration to your own nervous system. There is enough to do this and still have what I need. You are not hoping there is enough. You are acting as if there is enough before you have verified it. And that action, repeated week after week, month after month, rewires the baseline from which every other financial decision gets made. This is not mysticism. This is behavioral conditioning described in the language of the ancients, but fully supported by what we now know about how habitual action shapes belief. You do not think your way into a new operating assumption. You act your way into it consistently before the belief has arrived. The giving comes first. The psychological shift follows. The ancient teachers had no word for cognitive behavioral conditioning, but they built an exact practice that produces it. Here is the part that was buried. Here is what the map they burned was pointing at. The spiritual framing came second. The metaphysical language, the promises of return, the divine favor, the hundredfold harvest, that language was added to make the practice sticky, to give people a reason to do it before they had experienced its results directly. Every tradition that encoded the tithe needed a way to get people to comply before the benefit was visible. So the benefit was framed as divine. The compliance mechanism worked. But the mechanism underneath the mechanism, the actual reason the practice produced results, was psychological, behavioral, neurological. It was always about what the act of giving first does to the giver. Think about what Hannah wrote, the amount that belongs to the next voyage before this one is finished. He was not waiting for the next voyage to begin before he funded it. He was reaching into the present abundance, however large, however small, and pulling the future forward. He was telling his own mind, through the physical act of moving money, that the future was already real, already funded, already underway. Most people treat the future as a possibility. The tithe, practiced correctly, treats the future as a fact that the present is obligated to honor. And here is where the open question from earlier closes. Why did every civilization arrive at this exact practice independently? Because every civilization that survived long enough had merchants and farmers and traders trying to solve the same problem. How do you build forward motion when the present is consuming everything? Every one of them discovered the same answer through observation and repetition. The only practice that worked was the one that forced a transaction with the future before the present had finished spending. The fixed percentage made it non-negotiable, first made it structural rather than emotional, and the consistency turned it from a single act into an identity. You are not being asked to believe anything here. You are being asked to notice a pattern that crossed oceans and centuries and showed up unchanged in cultures that never spoke to each other. That is not coincidence. That is not religion. That is a technology for the human mind that predates every institution that ever tried to take credit for it. The practice is still available to you, right now. In your next paycheck, your next invoice, your next deposit, before anything else moves. Not when you feel abundant, because waiting to feel abundant before acting abundant is exactly the trap. The feeling follows the action. It has always followed the action. That is the whole point. In a later section, we will get to a point about how wealth actually accumulates that runs straight against the usual belief. When the contradiction resolves, it will change not what you want, but what you are willing to do first. The tithe was never about religion. It was always about which direction you face when money arrives, and whether you treat the future as something you hope for or something you fund. Chapter 7. Medieval guilds hid the multiplication principle in plain sight. Saving money does not build wealth. That sounds like something a person with no savings would say to feel better about spending. It is not. It is an observation about what wealthy people have always done that poor people were never told. Once you see the distinction clearly, the entire story of how money moves through the world will rearrange itself in your mind. You were taught to save. Save a portion of every paycheck. Build a cushion. Keep it safe. And saving is not nothing. The previous chapter showed you that facing the future means funding it. But here is what was carved out of that lesson before it ever reached your classroom. Saving is only the beginning of the process, not the process itself. The builders who accumulated lasting wealth across centuries were not the people who saved the most. They were the people who stopped selling hours at all. This chapter is about how they did it, why that knowledge was hidden inside a structure you never thought to study, and how the same principle sits available to you right now. The tithe was never about religion. It was always about which direction you face when money arrives, and whether you treat the future as something you hope for or something you fund. Now take that orientation and push it one step further. Funding the future is only meaningful if what you're feeding grows on its own. And that is exactly what the guild masters understood. Start with the question underneath this chapter, and it is worth sitting with. Why did medieval craftsmen organize themselves into guilds rather than simply selling their work independently and keeping all the profit? The easy answer is protection, safety in numbers, political influence. Those things are real, but they are not the whole answer. And the part that was left out is the part that matters most to you today. A guild was not simply a union of workers. It was an engineered multiplication system. The master craftsman at the top did not sell his time. He sold a standard, a mark, a reputation, and beneath him, journeymen and apprentices translated that reputation into hours of real labor. The master's name on a piece of leather or silver or cloth was worth more than any single pair of hands could produce. He had, over years, converted his skill into a system. And that system ran without him present. Think about that slowly. The master did not need to be at the bench for the bench to produce. His standard was already embedded in every person who trained under him. His mark was already trusted in every market that had seen his work. The knowledge he passed down was doing labor he was no longer doing himself. He had multiplied not his hours but his reach. This is the principle schools buried. Not as a conspiracy, but as a casualty of the Industrial Revolution, which needed workers who understood wages and nothing else. The moment wage labor became the dominant economic model, the multiplication principle became invisible. The system required you to believe that your time was the commodity, that 1 hour equals 1 unit of pay, and that the goal was to find a buyer for as many of those units as possible. That framing served factories. It did not serve you. Consider a craftsman named Arnaud, working in Bruges in the mid-1300s. He was a weaver, trained since childhood, and by his late 30s he had earned the rank of master in the Weavers' Guild. He could have kept his head down and produced cloth himself, hour by hour, until his hands gave out. Many did exactly that and died with nothing. Arnaud did something different. He trained 4 apprentices simultaneously, a risk, because it cost him time and materials to teach rather than produce. For 2 years his output actually dropped. His neighbors thought him foolish, but when those 4 apprentices became capable workers operating under his guild mark, Arnaud's effective production did not double, it quintupled. He was one man doing the work of 5 because he had encoded his skill into other human beings and into a reputation the market already trusted. By the time Arnaud was 50, he was not weaving at all. He was inspecting, directing, and selling. His hands were resting. His system was working. The lesson is not that you should hire people. Not yet. The lesson is simpler and older than that. What Arnaud did, and what every guild master who built lasting wealth understood, was this. Skill held inside one body is worth only what that body can produce in a day. Skill encoded into a system, A standard, a reputation, or a method multiplies every day without that body being present. The vocabulary is different today. We call it leverage, passive income, scalable delivery, but the principle is identical. It is the same map in a different language, and they burned the map. They just forgot to burn the territory. Here is your mirror moment. Go back 3 years in your mind, what you knew how to do, what you were good at, what people came to you for. Now ask yourself this. In those 3 years, did your skill grow faster than your income, or did they grow at the same rate? For most people, skill outpaced money considerably. You became better. You learned more. You delivered more. And your pay went up by a percentage that felt generous at the time and embarrassing in hindsight. That gap between what you know and what you earn is not a negotiation problem. It is a structure problem. You are still inside a wage model designed for a different kind of person in a different kind of world. The guild master would look at you and see wasted capital. Not because you are lazy or unskilled, but because everything you know is still trapped inside a single-point system. And you can only be one place at a time. Now here is where the counterintuitive truth from the opening of this chapter completes itself. Saving money does not build wealth because saving is a preservation act, not a multiplication act. You cannot preserve your way to financial freedom any more than Arnaud could have woven his way to it by working longer hours. The multiplication principle requires something different from you than discipline at the expense line. It requires you to start asking a different question entirely. The question most people ask is, how do I earn more? The question the guild masters asked was, how does what I know earn without me? Those two questions live in different universes. The first leads to raises, promotions, side hustles that demand your time, and an exhausted version of yourself who is slightly better paid than before. The second leads to systems. It leads to methods you write down, processes you teach, products that carry your knowledge to people you have never met while you sleep or eat or watch your children grow. This is not modern. This is ancient. The guild was the original passive income structure, dressed in leather aprons and candlelight. The master's mark was the original intellectual property. The apprenticeship system was the original scalable delivery model. None of these are new ideas. They are old ideas that were removed from your education at the exact moment the industrial economy needed you to stop thinking this way. And here is the thing nobody says directly. The removal was efficient. Within 2 generations of wage labor becoming normal, the multiplication principle had faded so completely from common knowledge that people stopped asking why the factory owner accumulated wealth while the workers inside did not. It seemed like a natural order. It was not natural. It was engineered, not out of malice, out of utility. Systems perpetuate the behavior they reward. The wage system rewarded compliance and penalized complexity. The multiplication principle requires complexity, so it went quiet, but it never stopped working. Every person you know who earns money without being physically present at a desk is using a version of what Arnaud used. Every person who licenses a method, sells a recorded course, earns a royalty, collects rent, or receives payment for work done once that is being used repeatedly. That person is a guild master in modern clothes. The vocabulary changed. The channel changed. The principle is exactly, precisely, identically the same. Now close the open question from earlier in this chapter, because you deserve the full answer. Why did craftsmen organize into guilds rather than simply working alone and keeping everything? The surface answer was protection. The real answer was that the guild structure forced multiplication. It forced masters to train. It forced knowledge to move out of single bodies and into systems. It forced a reputation to become worth more than any single craftsman's output. The guild was not just a social structure. It was a wealth technology. And like every powerful technology the powerful kept to themselves, it was eventually replaced by a simpler machine, the employee, and the knowledge of how the old machine worked was retired along with it. You are not retired. You have a skill right now, something you know, something you do, something people rely on you for that exists only inside you. That is where the leverage has always been waiting, not in a second job, not in a savings rate. In the conversion of what you know into something that works while you do not. Before long, we will get to a point about risk that runs straight against the usual belief. After that really registers, it shifts every financial decision you make from that point forward. For now, carry this. Ancient wealth builders never sold hours. They sold systems that multiplied while they slept. You were never taught that because a world of systems needs no factory floor. But you are not bound to that world. You were never meant to be. The only question left is what you are going to encode and who will carry it forward when your hands are at rest. Chapter 8. The code was hidden in philosophy, not finance. Something is quietly being lost from your life right now. It has no dramatic moment, no announcement. What you are losing is not arriving as a crisis. It arrives as a gap, quiet and widening, a gap between what you produce and what you keep. Every week you operate without the foundational principles of how wealth actually moves. You are not standing still. You are falling behind at compound speed. The income you earn but cannot hold, the value you create but cannot capture, the decisions you make without the framework that would have made them obvious, these are not small losses. They are architectural losses. They shape the entire structure of what your financial life becomes. The mechanism causing this loss is not laziness. It is not bad luck. It is missing code. Code that existed, fully formed and practically tested, more than 2,000 years ago. Code that was placed in a category called philosophy, so that you would never think to look for it in a book about money. That ends here. Here is something that was hidden in plain sight for most of recorded modern history. The men who wrote what we now call Stoic philosophy and Confucian teaching were not theorists. They were not academics sitting in comfortable rooms spinning abstract ideas about virtue. Marcus Aurelius governed the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen. He commanded armies, managed trade routes stretching from Britain to Persia, and made decisions about taxation and resource allocation that affected tens of millions of lives. Confucius was a minister of state in the kingdom of Lu. He advised rulers on governance, administration, and the organization of economic life. These were not men who wrote about wealth from a distance. They wrote about it from inside it. What happened to their work is the clearest example of the map they burned. The modern financial education system needed you to believe that wealth knowledge began with economics textbooks. It needed the story to start in a classroom, with a certified instructor, using an approved syllabus. Because if you knew that a Roman emperor had already documented a complete operating system for financial decision-making, and that it was sitting in a book you could read for free, the entire apparatus of credentialed financial advice would feel a great deal less necessary. So their writing got categorized as philosophy, as moral theory, as ancient history. Not as operational code, not as something you could use on Monday morning. But here is what nobody taught you about Marcus Aurelius. He wrote a passage in his private journal so direct it barely needs translation. He wrote, "Do not indulge in what you do not need, and do not fear what you cannot control. Every modern financial advisor will tell you a version of this, dressed in jargon about consumption habits and market volatility. Marcus said it in 2 clauses in private to himself, as a daily operating instruction. This was not a philosophical observation. It was a rule he used to run an empire. Revisit the person you were before these last 3 years unfolded and look at it plainly. Think about what you were spending money on, not the large purchases, but the small continuous ones. The ones that felt like they were barely costing you anything. Now think about what 3 years of redirecting even a fraction of that spending could have compounded into. That is not a hypothetical. That is the exact cost the missing principal was charging you, silently, every single month. Marcus did not theorize about restraint. He practiced calculated preservation. He understood something that was later buried under centuries of consumption-based economic theory. Every unit of value you do not release into unnecessary expenditure is a unit of value you retain in productive capacity. He was not talking about being poor. He was talking about the discipline that precedes all genuine wealth accumulation. The ancient Stoics called it oikonomia, the proper management of one's household resources. They meant it literally. Know exactly what enters your control. Know exactly what leaves it. Make every exit intentional. This chapter leaves one question open at the start for a reason, and it will take some time to arrive. Why did the most powerful practitioners of ancient wealth building write in the language of philosophy rather than the language of finance? The answer is not simple. And when it arrives, it will change how you read everything you thought you already knew. Now consider Confucius. He wrote in what was recorded as the Analects that the superior person examines their own character before they examine the conduct of others. For centuries, teachers presented this as an ethical instruction about humility. It is also a precise economic principle. Every failing business, every collapsed financial arrangement, every broken deal you have witnessed or experienced, trace the failure back far enough, and you will find a person who was analyzing the external problem without having examined their own contribution to it. Confucius was not writing poetry. He was writing a diagnostic checklist for anyone operating in environments of exchange and resource allocation. In one sentence, he described the exact cognitive discipline that separates people who learn from financial failure from people who repeat it. There is a parable that has survived through several trading cultures of the ancient East, though its exact origin has long been debated. A merchant named 𝗓𝗏 operated a grain trading post in a river city for 11 years. He was known for arriving early, leaving late, and keeping records that went back a decade. When a younger merchant came to him and asked why grain prices in the southern provinces seemed to move before any announcement was made, 𝗓𝗏 did not answer immediately. He poured 2 cups of tea. He let silence sit in the room. Then he said, "The announcement is always a reflection of something that already happened. If you are reading the announcement, you are reading history." He picked up a ledger and pointed to a line the younger man did not understand. He said, "This is where the actual signal lives. In what people did quietly before they spoke." The younger man left, studied that ledger, and spent the next several years learning to read behavior rather than declarations. 3 years later, his trading post was the most profitable in the district. 𝗓𝗏 retired that same year, carrying nothing that had not been earned through the same discipline his teacher's teacher had passed to him, in a language the market never announced out loud. You just absorbed a principle that most business schools still have not formally codified. Read behavior, not announcements. Watch the quiet move, not the loud one. Confucius also wrote about what he called the rectification of names. The idea was this: when words are used incorrectly, work becomes impossible. When work becomes impossible, prosperity collapses. He was writing about the chaos that follows when the language used inside an organization or household stops accurately reflecting reality. When the thing called a plan is not actually a plan. When the thing called an investment is actually speculation. When the thing called security is actually stagnation, the entire structure begins to operate on false signals. This is not philosophical musing. This is a business diagnosis. You have likely felt this in your own financial life. A moment when you realized you had been calling something by the wrong name, and that wrong name had been costing you in ways you could not measure until you changed the word. Now back to the question you heard earlier. Why did these practitioners write in the language of philosophy? The answer is this. In the ancient world, there was no separation between philosophical discipline and operational practice. The division you inherited, where philosophy is abstract and finance is concrete, was invented later. It was invented specifically during the period when Western economic theory was being codified as a formal academic discipline. That period needed to distinguish itself from everything that came before it. So it drew a line. It called everything before the line wisdom literature and everything after the line economics. That line was not natural. It was constructed, and it cost you access to centuries of tested, practiced, field-proven wealth code. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." Every person who studied Stoicism in a literature class was told this was a coping philosophy for adversity. It is also a capital allocation principle. Every obstacle in a market creates a pricing inefficiency. Every disruption produces a gap between what a thing is worth and what the panicking crowd will pay for it. Marcus was not writing about enduring hardship with grace. He was writing from lived experience managing a civilization under military and economic pressure, about the productive value of friction. Where others see obstruction, position yourself to see opportunity. This principle has generated more wealth across more centuries than almost any financial concept taught in a modern university. The modern financial education system did not just fail to teach you this. It actively discouraged the category of thinking that would have led you here. Because a person who thinks this way does not need the system's products in the same way. A person operating on Stoic Confucian economic principles needs less credit, makes fewer reactive decisions, holds value longer, builds wealth through discipline rather than through institutional products that carry fees and dependency. That is not a profitable customer. So the category got labeled philosophy. Philosophy got labeled optional, and optional got quietly dropped from the curriculum of anyone being prepared to work inside a system rather than build outside one. Down the line in this book, we will get to a point about patience, about whether waiting is passive or active that runs straight against the usual belief. When that contradiction resolves, it will change the specific way you make your next financial decision. But for now, carry this. The code was not hidden because it was obscure. It was hidden because it was dangerous to the right people. And the clearest proof that it worked is that the people who practiced it, Marcus Aurelius, the Confucian administrators, the ancient merchant classes who encoded these principles into trade culture, operated at a level of sustained productivity and resource preservation that modern financial education has never replicated at scale. What was buried still works. The map they burned had roads on it, and you are walking on them now. Philosophy was never separate from the practice of building wealth. It was the operating system. The practice ran on. Chapter 9. Why the Industrial Revolution Buried the Code. Compulsory schooling was not designed to educate you. That sounds like the kind of claim someone makes on a late-night radio broadcast with a tinfoil edge in their voice. It is not. It is a documented economic decision made by specific men in specific rooms for specific reasons. Those reasons had nothing to do with your flourishing. Once you see who built the system you were handed, and why they built it exactly the way they did, the gaps in your financial education stop looking like oversights. They start looking like architecture. Here is the question you should hold from the beginning of this chapter. If the ancient principles of wealth creation were so effective, so durable across thousands of years of human civilization, what would it take to make an entire society forget them in less than 3 generations? Hold that question. The answer arrives sooner than you expect, and it is worse than most people are willing to admit. You came up through a system that taught you to read a clock before it taught you to read a contract. That was not random. The previous chapter closed with a precise observation. Philosophy was never separate from the practice of building wealth. It was the operating system the practice ran on. The ancients understood this. Roman merchants, Medici bankers, the trading guilds of medieval Florence, they all operated from a philosophical foundation that treated wealth not as a lucky outcome, but as a learnable discipline, governed by principles older than any single civilization. Those principles moved through cultures like seeds move through wind. They landed, took root, produced results, and were passed from teacher to student, from father to son, from master to apprentice. Then something happened, something deliberate. In 1848, a Prussian educator named Friedrich Froebel was banned from operating kindergartens in Prussia. The official reason was that his schools promoted socialism. The real reason was more instructive. Froebel's approach emphasized independent thinking, creative problem-solving, and the internal development of the child. The Prussian state, then rapidly industrializing, needed something different. They needed children who would grow into workers who could follow instructions, maintain schedules, and accept hierarchical authority without resistance. The Prussian model of compulsory mass education became the template copied by the United States, Britain, and most of Europe. It was built on a 3-part foundation: obedience, punctuality, the ability to perform repetitive tasks without complaint. Notice what is absent from that list. Across the Atlantic, the industrialists were paying close attention. Andrew Carnegie, whose steel empire consumed hundreds of thousands of workers, was explicit in his correspondence about the value of an educated but non-entrepreneurial workforce. John D. Rockefeller funded the General Education Board starting in 1903, an organization that shaped American public schooling curriculum at a national level. The board's own published document stated its purpose with startling clarity. Frederick Gates, who ran the board, wrote in 1906 that the goal was not to produce scholars, inventors, or men of ideas. The goal was to produce men and women who would do in a perfect way the things their fathers and mothers had done before them. The language is almost gentle. The implications are not. Call up the person you were before these last 3 years unfolded and look at it plainly. Think about what you knew about interest, about compounding, about the relationship between the price of your time and the ceiling on your income. Think about whether any adult in your formal schooling ever sat you down and explained that a wage is not a wealth-building tool. It is a stability tool, and a limited one. Think about whether the words leverage, asset, or cash flow were ever part of a lesson plan. For most people, the answer is no. Not occasionally no. Categorically no, across 12 or more years of required education. That is not an accident. Here is a name you may not have encountered in school: Horace Mann. Mann is credited as the father of the American Common School movement. He traveled to Prussia in 1843, observed their factory-aligned education model, and returned to Massachusetts convinced it was the future of American schooling. He was not corrupt. He was not a villain in any simple sense. He was a genuine reformer who believed universal literacy would democratize society. But he carried the Prussian model home like a blueprint, and that blueprint contained a structural absence. It taught children what to think about, not how to think about value, trade, and the generation of surplus wealth. The ancient code did not make it into that blueprint. It was never included. Once compulsory schooling spread across the industrialized world, the informal networks that had transmitted this knowledge began to dissolve. The apprenticeship systems, the merchant guilds, the family-to-family transmission of financial philosophy, all of it. Within 2 generations, most families had lost the thread entirely. What was buried still works. This is the part worth holding carefully. The principles themselves did not disappear because they were removed from curricula. The law of exchange did not change because no teacher mentioned it. The relationship between produced value and accumulated wealth did not stop functioning because it was absent from a textbook. The map was burned. The territory remained. Consider a woman named 𝗓𝗓𝗧𝗔𝗡𝗧. She grew up in Lagos in the early 1980s, the daughter of a seamstress who had never attended school past the age of 12. Clara watched her mother operate a business from the front room of their home. She managed inventory, negotiated with fabric suppliers, extended informal credit to trusted customers, and maintained a mental ledger of every transaction she had ever made. Clara's mother had never heard the word entrepreneurship. She had never read a business book, but she understood in her bones and in her daily practice that wealth was not something you received. It was something you constructed, trade by trade, relationship by relationship, value delivered and value returned. Clara went to university. She studied economics for 4 years. She graduated and spent a decade as a mid-level bank employee before the memory of her mother's front-room business finally pulled her back to what had been sitting in front of her the whole time. The degree had taught her what the institution wanted her to know. Her mother had preserved, without naming it, what the institution had removed. Clara's mother was not exceptional. She was a carrier. Before the Industrial Revolution completed its restructuring of daily life, most ordinary people were in direct contact with the principles this book has been recovering. A blacksmith understood the relationship between skill, scarcity, and price. A grain merchant understood leverage. A weaver understood capital. The loom was not just a tool. It was a productive asset that generated income beyond the weaver's own labor hours. These were not theoretical understandings. They were practical, lived daily. The factory system changed this by separating the worker from the product, from the pricing, from the profit. The worker's relationship to wealth was reduced to a single variable, the wage. And the educational system built to support the factory system was never designed to complicate that relationship. This is the revelation that sits at the center of this chapter, and it is not a conspiracy. It does not require shadowy rooms or coded documents. It requires only honest accounting of documented incentives. When the men who funded mass education also employed the graduates of that education, their incentive was to produce workers, not competitors. When the curriculum designers modeled their system on a Prussian framework built for military and industrial compliance, the result was a generation, and then another, and another that entered adult financial life without the foundational principles that every pre-industrial culture had transmitted as a matter of survival. You were handed that inheritance. An education optimized for producing useful employees, not capable builders of independent wealth. And the most effective feature of that design is that it made the gap feel natural. If you never learned that a different foundation existed, the floor they gave you feels like the only floor. The absence is invisible precisely because it is so complete. A little later, we arrive at an argument about where financial wisdom comes from that runs straight against the usual belief. Once that becomes real to you, it shifts the first decision you make about your own money every single morning. But right now, let us close the loop we opened at the start. What would it take to make an entire society forget ancient wealth principles in less than 3 generations? You know the answer now. It would take a compulsory system, funded by those with an interest in compliance, modeled on frameworks built for industrial output, and spread universally enough that the informal transmission network simply had no room left to breathe. It would not require malice in every individual involved. It would only require a structure with a built-in incentive, applied consistently over time. That is precisely what happened. And here is the forward edge of this. The same mechanism that buried the code cannot unbury it. A system designed to produce a specific outcome does not reform itself toward a different one. The school that never taught you about the velocity of money is not going to add that lesson next semester. The curriculum that skipped the relationship between personal value creation and wealth accumulation is not being revised. The map was burned. And no institution that benefited from burning it is offering to redraw it, which means the recovery has always been a personal act. The principles were not locked away in a vault. They were not destroyed. They were set aside, crowded out, made to seem irrelevant by a structure that depended on your not applying them. But they are available. They have always been available. What you were missing was not access. What you were missing was the recognition that you had been given a floor with a false ceiling built into it. And the moment you recognize that ceiling as constructed rather than natural, it stops functioning as a ceiling at all. The code was not hidden from you because it was dangerous. It was hidden from you because it was useful. And someone else wanted that utility for themselves. Chapter 10. The 5 Principles That Survived Every Economic Collapse. Right now, something is draining from your life that you cannot see on any statement. It has no account number, no balance displayed, but it is real, and it is compounding every single day you do not have access to it. The thing you are losing is not money itself. It is the understanding that generates money, the knowledge of how wealth actually moves, how it actually builds, how it has always actually worked. And here is what makes this particular loss different from most. The longer you go without it, the more expensive that gap becomes. Not because you are making mistakes, because the mechanics of wealth do not pause while you search for the manual. They continue operating, with or without your awareness, in the direction of whoever holds the principles. This chapter gives you the principles. Not theories invented last decade and dressed in modern language. The real ones. The ones carved into stone, pressed into clay tablets, whispered between merchants across 3,000 years of collapsed empires and rebuilt economies. They have survived everything, and you are about to meet all 5. You already heard how this knowledge was taken. The code was not hidden from you because it was dangerous. It was hidden from you because it was useful, and someone else wanted that utility for themselves. That sentence should sit with you for a moment, because what follows from it is this. If the principles were taken, they can also be recovered. And if they survived every economic collapse that ever swept a civilization off the map, then they will survive your current circumstances too, whatever those circumstances are right now. Here is the question this chapter opened with, before you even knew it was a question. Can 5 principles, just 5, actually account for every major wealth pattern across every known civilization? Hold that question. The answer is not what you expect, and that answer will be yours before this chapter ends. The first principle is older than currency itself. Anthropologists who study trade networks in pre-monetary societies keep finding the same pattern. Communities that thrived across generations were not the ones that hoarded resources. They were the ones that circulated them with precision, not generosity for its own sake. Precision. They understood that a resource held static loses force, while a resource moving through the right channels gains it. The Mesopotamians had a word for this dynamic. Medieval Arab trade scholars formalized it. Scottish merchant guilds in the 1600s built entire operating codes around it. And yet the average 28-year-old today was never told this principle exists. Call this first principle return before retention. Every lasting wealth builder across history prioritized the rate at which resources returned to them over the amount they could store in any single moment. A merchant in Alexandria who could turn a shipment in 30 days was wealthier in practice than one who held 10 times the inventory in a warehouse. The velocity of return mattered more than the size of the pile. You feel this principle when you recognize it. Something in you has always known that sitting on potential is not the same as building from it. Now consider a man named Kofi, a cloth trader operating in coastal West Africa in the early 19th century. He inherited almost nothing from his father, a small loom, a reputation for fair dealing, and a single rule his father had whispered to him the morning he died: never let the cloth sleep. Kofi did not interpret this as a command to be reckless. He interpreted it as a command to understand the difference between cloth that was resting and cloth that was dead. Cloth resting was cloth he had lent to a neighboring weaver to finish, cloth on its way to market, cloth promised against a future delivery. Cloth that was dead was cloth sitting in a locked room earning nothing, touching nothing, moving toward no one. Within 12 years, Kofi was one of the most connected traders in his region, not because he produced more cloth than anyone else, because his cloth never slept. When economic disruption hit that coast, and it did, repeatedly, Kofi's network of moving relationships kept him solvent while men with larger storehouses collapsed under the weight of inventory they could not turn. Do not reach for the lesson immediately. Just let Kofi's locked room and his living cloth exist in your mind for a breath. The second principle is the one most aggressively buried by modern financial education, because it directly threatens the system designed to produce compliant workers. Call it ownership over income. Every civilization that produced lasting private wealth, not temporary wages, not one-generation prosperity, but wealth that compounded across decades, did so through ownership of productive assets, not through the accumulation of wages. The Roman Republic understood this. The merchant families of Florence understood it. The trading houses of 17th century Amsterdam were built entirely on this principle. And yet the entire architecture of modern schooling was deliberately constructed, to produce people who would prize a reliable income over the risks and rewards of ownership. You were trained to want a salary. The people who designed that training wanted something else entirely. Bring to mind the person you were before these last 3 years unfolded, and look at it plainly. Think about what you were earning, what you were spending, and what you owned. Not in terms of objects, in terms of productive assets, things that generate returns whether you are working or not. If that number was close to zero 3 years ago, and it is still close to zero today, that is not a personal failure. That is the exact outcome the system was designed to produce. And now that you can see the design, you can begin to act outside of it. The third principle appears in every post-collapse recovery in recorded history, without a single exception. Call it selective concentration. After every major economic collapse, from the fall of Rome to the collapse of the Ming Dynasty treasury to the Great Depression, the individuals who recovered fastest and built the most durable wealth afterward were not the ones who diversified everything they had. They were the ones who concentrated their remaining resources into the single area where they had the clearest edge and the deepest understanding. Diversification is a preservation strategy for people who already have enough. Concentration is a building strategy for people who are still in the process of creating enough. The map they burned, the one that showed how wealth actually works, had this principle drawn in bold lines across the center. Because a system that needs you to stay small cannot afford for you to understand the difference between preserving wealth and building it. The fourth principle is the one that feels almost spiritual until you see its mechanics. Call it reciprocal reputation. In every pre-modern economy, and in every informal economy that still functions today beneath the surface of formal institutions, your name moved faster than your goods. The Silk Road did not function on contracts enforced by courts. It functioned on reputation networks that were centuries old. A merchant whose word had failed once faced barriers that no legal system needed to impose. The market itself closed. A merchant whose word had held across difficult transactions found doors open in cities where no one had ever met them in person. This is not a moral argument. It is a mechanical observation. Reputation is a compound asset. It builds slowly, it pays for decades, and it cannot be counterfeited by people who did not do the actual work of earning it. In the modern economy, this principle has been buried under the noise of personal branding and social performance. Those are not the same thing. Real reciprocal reputation is built in private, in the moments when no one is watching, in the transactions where cutting a corner would have cost nothing visible. You know the difference between those two things already. The fifth principle is the shortest to state and the most difficult to execute. Call it deferred clarity. Every major wealth builder in every economic era made consequential decisions with incomplete information. Not reckless decisions, consequential ones. They moved before the picture was fully clear. They understood that waiting for complete clarity is not caution. It is a different kind of risk. The risk of motion is visible and immediate. The risk of stillness is invisible and compounding. The ancient Phoenician traders who opened new sea routes did not know what they would find. They knew what staying in port would cost them. That calculation, not certainty, but the comparison of two different risks, is what deferred clarity actually means. You defer the need for complete clarity in order to gain something more valuable. The compounding advantage of early movement. Principles that survive multiple civilizational collapses are not theories. They are laws as reliable as physics. Gravity did not need the 20th century to start working. It worked in the same direction on a Roman senator, and on a Mayan builder, and on a person standing in a field 1,000 years before either of those civilizations existed. These 5 principles operated the same way. They were not invented by clever people in prosperous times. They were discovered by people under pressure, real pressure, the kind that burns away everything that is not essential, and what remained was what always works. Return before retention, ownership over income, selective concentration, reciprocal reputation, deferred clarity. Say those slowly. Not as a memory exercise, as a recognition exercise, because something in you already knew these existed. You have felt them pulling at the edges of decisions you have made. You have felt the cost of acting against them without knowing why the cost arrived. What you did not have was the language to name them, and the confidence that comes from knowing they have already survived everything the world has thrown at an economy. Further on, we arrive at an argument about the right time to start applying principles like these that run straight against the usual belief. When that idea snaps into focus, it shifts how you act, not just what you think. And here is where the open loop from the start of this chapter closes. Can 5 principles actually account for every major wealth pattern across every known civilization? The answer is not that 5 principles are enough. The answer is that these 5 principles are what remains after you remove everything that did not survive. Every economic system that collapsed took its own unique features with it. What you are holding now is what those collapses could not destroy. That is not a small thing to be holding. What does a person do the morning after they finally have the map? Chapter 11. Apply the ancient code in a digital economy. Saving less money is often a faster path to wealth than saving more. That sounds reckless. It sounds like something a person says right before they lose everything. But stay with this for a moment. The version of saving you were taught, cautious, passive, quietly tucking dollars into an account and waiting, was never designed to build wealth. It was designed to build patience. And patience without direction is just delay dressed up as virtue. The ancient builders of lasting wealth did not save because they feared loss. They moved money because they understood flow. There is a difference so significant that once you see it, every piece of conventional financial advice you have ever received will need to be re-examined. This chapter is about the morning after the map arrives, not the discovering, the doing. What the code actually looks like when you press it against the texture of the world you live in right now today, with the phone in your pocket and the digital economy humming around you. Here is the open loop this chapter will close. Why do people who understand wealth principles on an intellectual level still fail to use them? You will have the answer before this chapter ends, and it is not the answer you expect. You woke up with the map. Good. Now the first thing most people do with a map is read it again. They study the lines, trace the routes, look for confirmation, and the day slips by. Then another. Then a week passes and the map is memorized but the feet have not moved. The ancient principle at the root of this chapter is the principle of engaged capital. Every civilization that produced multi-generational wealth understood one thing clearly. Money sitting still is money working for someone else's future, not yours. The Phoenician merchants of Tyre did not build trading empires by holding silver in clay jars. The medieval guild masters of Florence did not accumulate influence by clutching coin and waiting. They moved resources. They attached their capital to motion, human motion, seasonal motion, the motion of goods traveling between places where something was plentiful and places where it was scarce. The vehicle was a ship, a trade route, a loom, a ledger. The principle underneath was always the same. In a digital economy, the vehicles have multiplied enormously, and this is both the gift and the trap. Go back to the person you were before these last 3 years unfolded and look at it plainly. Not geographically, financially, mentally. Think about how many options you were aware of. Compare that to how many you know exist right now today. The number has grown, and yet the weight of decision has also grown. More options produce more hesitation. More hesitation produces more delay. And delay, in a system built on compounding, is the single most expensive habit a person in their 20s or 30s can maintain. So the first translation of the ancient code into your current world is this. Choose one vehicle with the same intentionality a Phoenician captain chose his route. Not the perfect vehicle, not the optimal vehicle, a specific vehicle that moves money in the direction of value creation rather than value storage. Marcus was 26 when he understood this. He had a full-time job in logistics, a small amount of savings, and 12 browser tabs open at any given time, each one representing a different opportunity someone online had told him was the key. Crypto, index funds, real estate wholesaling, dropshipping, print on demand. He had read about all of them. He had started none of them. What Marcus had done without knowing it was confuse information with motion. He had been studying the map so intensively that the map had become the destination. One evening, he closed every tab except one, not because that one was objectively better than the others, because it was the one he understood well enough to explain to someone else in 2 minutes. 3 months later, he had turned a $200 investment into a small side revenue stream he could reinvest. Not life-changing yet, but moving. And money in motion, even at slow speed, builds the skills that money sitting still cannot teach you. The vehicle Marcus chose does not matter. Yours will be different. What matters is the decision to move. Now here is where the ancient code pushes back against almost everything the modern financial education system taught you. You were taught to diversify early. Do not put everything in one place. Spread the risk. And this is reasonable advice for someone protecting wealth they have already built. It is paralyzing advice for someone who has not built it yet. The ancient equivalent would be telling a young merchant to split his single season's inventory between 6 different caravans going in 6 different directions. At small scale, all you accomplish is ensuring that none of the caravans have enough cargo to be worth the trip. Concentration before diversification. That is the second translation. Pick the single principle from this book that most directly applies to your situation right now: value exchange, compounding, scarcity leverage, the velocity of resources, and apply it completely before splitting your attention. The ancient wealth builders were not scattered in their early years. They went deep in one direction, built a wedge of competence and capital, and only expanded outward once the center was solid. Here is what that looks like in practical terms. If you choose value exchange as your starting point, meaning you are going to create and offer something that solves a problem people already have, then the full translation means identifying one specific problem in one specific community and solving it completely. Not spreading across 5 different offers to 5 different audiences before any of them trust you. If you choose the velocity principle, money moving faster returns faster, then the translation means examining every dollar you currently have in motion. Ask whether it is moving at the speed it could be, or whether it is sitting in an account earning fractions of a percent while the merchants of your era run circles around it. Every century produces new instruments. Every decade produces new platforms. The instrument is not the code. A weaver in 14th century Bruges and a content creator in 21st century Atlanta are operating with machinery separated by 700 years, but both are converting a skill into a repeatable, scalable exchange. The weaver's loom and the creator's recording setup are separated by centuries of invention. The principle underneath, that specific skill applied with consistent output, creates a surplus that can be reinvested, is older than either of them. This is what was buried. Not a secret investment, not a hidden asset class. The understanding that value flows toward usefulness, that usefulness must be expressed repeatedly to build trust, and that trust is the actual currency of every economy, digital or physical, ancient or modern. Now back to the open loop. Why do people who understand these principles still fail to use them? The answer is not laziness. It is not lack of information. The answer is misalignment between their self-concept and their actions. They understand the principle, but they do not yet see themselves as the kind of person who executes it. The modern financial education system never taught you content. It taught you identity. It taught you that finance is for people with credentials, that investment is for people with surplus, that building is for people with resources. And when you hear a wealth principle that resonates, the resonance is immediately followed by a quiet internal objection. That might work for someone else. That objection is the last remaining mechanism of the system that buried the code. The ancient builders of wealth did not have a special class. In Mesopotamia, the first written lending contracts were between farmers and merchants of nearly identical social standing. The principle was accessible not because of wealth already held, but because of understanding. They understood that surplus deployed returns more surplus. They acted on it, and the accumulation began. You are not waiting for permission. You are only waiting for yourself to stop waiting. The third translation, digital leverage, is the modern equivalent of the ancient trading post. A trading post worked because it aggregated the needs of a region in one place, reduced the friction of transaction, and made exchange happen faster and at lower cost than it would without it. Your ability to reach people through a screen right now today, at essentially zero distribution cost, is the most powerful leverage tool in the history of private wealth creation. The printing press disrupted the church's monopoly on information. The internet disrupted every institution's monopoly on reach. You are alive in the window when reach is free. Attention is the scarce resource, and the person who understands how to solve real problems and communicate that solution clearly holds a leverage position that a Florentine merchant would have paid enormous sums to possess. Use it. That is not an exhortation. It is a translation. The ancient principle is, position yourself where the exchange happens. In the ancient world, that meant physical proximity to trade routes. In your world, it means being present and specific in the places where your people already gather to look for solutions. Here is where the code becomes not just intellectual but operational. You pick one principle. You pick one vehicle for expressing it. You pick one community of people who share one specific problem. And then you apply the most ancient rule of all. Consistency over time beats intensity in bursts. Every market in human history has rewarded the person who showed up predictably over the person who appeared spectacularly once. Reliability is trust. Trust is exchange. Exchange is wealth. Soon, we arrive at an argument about timing specifically, about when the right moment to begin is that runs straight against the usual belief. Once that lands, it reshapes not just what you plan but what you do before your next morning is over. The code is not younger or older than you. It does not care about the economy's current shape or the tools currently in fashion. Ships became railroads. Railroads became phone lines. Phone lines became fiber. The principle of moving value toward places where it is needed has not changed since the first trade route was walked by a person carrying something someone else wanted. What was buried still works, not as a metaphor, as an instruction. The question now is not whether these principles apply to your world. The question is which one you will move on first, and whether you will move on it before the next chapter gives you a reason to keep reading instead. Chapter 12. You were robbed before you were ready. Every civilization that has ever risen and fallen left behind the same silent division. In every age, across every culture that kept records and everyone that did not, there were two kinds of people. Those who understood how resources accumulated, and those who spent their lives confused about why they never did. It was never simply talent. It was never simply effort. Something was being passed to certain people and withheld from others, and the line between those two groups was rarely about what they deserved. That pattern is ancient, and here is what matters to you right now. That same pattern is still running. You have almost certainly been sitting on the wrong side of it without ever knowing why. You did not end up here by accident. This chapter is going to show you what was taken when it was taken and why the taking was never your fault. And once you see it clearly, the shame you have been carrying is going to have nowhere left to stand. Here is the open question. You will have heard it before, maybe said it yourself on a bad night. Why does it feel so hard when you are doing everything right? Hold that question. Keep it close. The answer is coming, but it needs context first. Without context, it will sound like an excuse. And it is not an excuse at all. Think about the last time you felt genuinely behind financially. Not the abstract worry, but the specific moment. The rent that stretched further than your account. The conversation you could not finish because the numbers did not add up. Or simply the quiet, familiar feeling that everyone else received a manual you never got. That feeling is real, and it is pointing at something true about how this system was built, not something true about your ability or your worth. You were a child when the most important financial decisions about your life were made for you, not by your parents necessarily, though they were caught in the same current, by institutions, by curriculum designers who sat in rooms you were never invited into and decided what you would and would not learn before you were old enough to ask why. You were taught to read a clock before you were taught to read a contract. You memorized the dates of wars but not the mechanics of interest. You were graded on your ability to follow instruction and given no grade at all for understanding how money actually moves. That was not accidental. The modern education system was not designed to produce wealth builders. Trace it back honestly. Follow the thread of why compulsory schooling was structured the way it was, and you arrive at the same answer every time. It was built to produce reliable workers. People who showed up on time, followed direction, produced output, and trusted that the system would take care of them if they complied. This is not a theory. It is the visible architecture of a century of economic history. The map they burned was the one that showed you another way to stand in relation to money entirely. There is a woman named Dara. She grew up in a household where money was discussed the way weather was discussed. Something that happened to you outside your control, something you braced for. Her parents worked constantly. They were not careless. They were not lazy. They were doing precisely what every institution in their lives had prepared them to do, which was trade time for income and hope the math worked out. Dara went to school, excelled, and earned a degree in accounting of all things. She graduated knowing how to record other people's wealth without the first real understanding of how to build her own. She knew debits and credits. She did not know how to think about an asset. She knew how to calculate interest on a loan. Nobody had ever asked her to calculate how compound growth could work in her favor. She spent her late 20s confused and ashamed. She was convinced the gap between her knowledge and her circumstances was a personal failure. Then she found a handwritten business primer from the early 19th century in her grandmother's attic. It had been left by a great great uncle who had run a modest trading operation. In 30 pages, he had described more practical wealth logic than 4 years of formal education had given her. She was not slow. She had simply never been handed the material. The shame did not belong to her. It never had. Here is the mirror moment. Look back 3 years in your mind in your relationship with money. Not the number in your account, but your understanding. What did you actually know about how wealth forms? What had anyone ever sat down and genuinely taught you, not about getting a job or balancing a budget, but about the principles underneath the whole structure? Take a breath and be honest with yourself. If that knowledge was thin, that thinness is not evidence of your character. It is evidence of what was withheld. The shame was engineered. That is the sentence this chapter is building toward, and it deserves to land without decoration. The gap in your financial life was not produced by your failure. It was produced by a system that required the gap to exist. Compliant workers who feel vaguely inadequate about money do not question the structure that underpays them. People who carry shame rarely ask the structural questions that shame is designed to suppress. The self-blame was a feature, not a side effect. Keep that steady in your mind. What was buried still works. That is the counterweight to everything you just heard, and it matters as much as the anger. The principles excluded from your education are not outdated. They are not locked inside institutions that will never let you in. They are not protected by credentials you do not have. They are older than economics as a named discipline. They were operating in the markets of the ancient world, in the trading posts that built early merchant wealth, in the quiet financial decisions of people who never once sat in a formal classroom. The map they burned was not the only copy. You are holding a copy right now. The question from the last chapter was which principle you would move on first. That question still stands, but this chapter adds something underneath it. You cannot move with full force toward something if part of you still believes you do not deserve it. Or worse, that your confusion about money proves something about who you are. That belief has to go, not by pretending it was not there, but by understanding exactly how it got there. By seeing the hand that placed it. By recognizing that the hand was not yours. Righteous anger is a clean fuel, just do not let it idle. Let it move you forward, not inward. The system that withheld the material did not win. You found the material. You are inside it right now. You did not fail the wealth test. You were never given the study material. The moment you stop spending energy on the wrong explanation for your situation, you have that energy back, all of it, ready to be pointed at something real. The next chapter is going to ask you to do something unusual with what you now know about yourself. Not to forgive the system, not to forget it, but to use the very clarity it tried to prevent you from having as the exact foundation on which you start to build. What happens when the person they tried to keep uninformed becomes the most informed person in the room? Chapter 13. The code was always inside you, school just buried it. You already know something is off, not about the world in general, about you specifically. There is a version of yourself you have caught glimpses of, someone who moves through financial decisions with clarity and ease, someone who does not flinch at the word wealth, someone who builds things rather than waiting to be chosen. You have seen that person in flashes, late at night when the fear quiets down, in a moment of bold action that surprised even you. And then the moment passed. The familiar fog returned. And you went back to wondering why the code everyone else seems to have was never handed to you. Here is what this chapter is going to settle, once and for all. The code was never withheld from you. It was never locked in a vault somewhere waiting for the right key. What happened is both simpler and more disturbing than that. It was inside you from the beginning. Something very deliberate, very systematic, and very old was applied over it layer by layer until you forgot it was there. The question now is not how you acquire it. The question is how you remember it. You left the last chapter standing in a doorway. The question was sitting in the air. What happens when the person they tried to keep uninformed becomes the most informed person in the room? Hold that question. The answer is not what you might expect. It is not power over others. It is not revenge against a system. What happens is simpler and rarer and far more valuable. You stop asking the system for permission. Remember the person you were before these last 3 years unfolded and look at it plainly. Not in terms of circumstances, in terms of how you saw yourself around money. Did you feel like someone capable of generating wealth? Or did you feel like someone hoping to receive enough of it? The distance between those two self-images is not a personality difference. It is not intelligence. It is not ambition. It is the residue of an education designed with a very specific outcome in mind. Here is the open question that will carry through this chapter. If the wealth code is innate, if it was wired into human beings long before any school ever opened, then what exactly is education removing? Not information. Something older than information. Something you need to name before you can reclaim it. There is an old story told in the trading cities of ancient Phoenicia, passed down not in books but in practice, one merchant to the next. His name was Hanno. He was not born into a merchant family. His father was a fisherman who worked the same stretch of sea every day of his life and died with the same net he was given as a young man. Hanno grew up watching his father trade the same way, same buyers, same price, same outcome, year after year. One morning, when Hanno was 11 years old, he watched a foreign trader arrive at the dock. This man spoke a different language, wore different cloth, carried a different scale. And in 20 minutes, using nothing but a few gestures and a willingness to hold the silence longer than the other person, he walked away with twice the return Hanno's father had earned all morning. Hanno did not ask his father what happened. He already knew. The foreign trader had read the moment, the buyer's hesitation, the surplus on the dock, the unspoken need, and he had priced accordingly. Hanno spent the next 3 years watching every transaction at that dock, saying almost nothing, touching nothing, just watching. By 14, he was trading on his own, not because anyone taught him, because he stopped suppressing what he could already see. Let that sit for a moment. Hanno did not go to school. He went back to his own perception. The ability to read value, read timing, read the invisible gap between what something costs and what it is worth, that was not learned. It was remembered. The forgetting was what took effort. The remembering was natural. This is the inversion the entire book has been building toward. In the first chapter, the ancient wealth code was framed as something hidden, something buried in history, something that had to be excavated from under centuries of misdirection. That framing was true, but only halfway. The code was hidden, the burial was real. The misdirection was deliberate, but the place it was hidden was not in old manuscripts or forgotten trading routes. It was hidden inside the person reading this. Inside you. Every child comes into the world with the raw material of wealth instinct, the ability to assess value, the capacity to trade attention and energy for things that matter, the drive to create something from nothing when the alternative is going without. Survival itself is the original economy, and every human being who made it past infancy carries that original economy in their cells. What school does not by accident, not by neglect, but by design, is install a competing operating system on top of that instinct. Show up on time. Follow instructions. Earn your grade. Wait for the evaluation. Accept the assigned value of your work. Do not price yourself. Do not negotiate your conditions. Trust the institution to determine what you are worth. Run that program for 12 years, then 16, then 30. What you get is a person who is brilliant, capable, perceptive, and completely convinced that the only path to financial stability is to be chosen by someone above them. A person who distrusts their own reading of a situation. A person who asks for permission before acting on what they can clearly see. The system does not produce bad people. It produces dependent ones. And dependency is the one condition that makes wealth nearly impossible to build. Here is what fills the gap when you stop asking for permission. It is not recklessness. It is not arrogance. It is the quiet return of something you were born knowing. How to look at an exchange and sense its fairness. How to notice when your labor is being priced below its value and say something about it. How to recognize an opportunity not because someone labeled it one, but because you can feel the gap between what exists and what is needed. These are not advanced financial skills. They are basic human perceptions that got trained out of you somewhere between age 6 and age 22. The map they burned was not a map of the world. It was a map of you. Your own instincts, rendered illegible by years of instruction that said, your perception is less reliable than the institution's. Your judgment needs certification before it counts. Your sense of value requires external validation. Burn enough of those maps and a person forgets they ever had a sense of direction. But here is what this book has been proving, chapter by chapter. The instincts are still there. Every time you read a situation correctly and then second-guessed yourself, they were there. Every time you sensed that a job was underpaying you before you found the numbers to confirm it, they were there. Every time you felt the pull toward an idea and then talked yourself out of it with reasons that sounded responsible but felt like fear, they were there. Alive, patient, waiting to be trusted again. The ancient code is not older than economics. It is older than language. It runs in the same part of you that knows when someone is being dishonest without being able to explain why. The same part that knows when a room is tense before anyone says a word. The same part that has always known, on some level, that you are more capable than the box you were handed. This is what the educational system removed from every classroom. Not the formula for compound interest. Not the mechanics of starting a business. Those can be taught in an afternoon. What was removed carefully, consistently, over generations, was the belief that your own perception of value is trustworthy. That your instincts about money and exchange and worth are not dangerous impulses to be managed, but instruments to be used. Hanno never forgot that belief because no one had yet had the chance to take it from him. You are older. The taking already happened, but the instrument is still there under the layers. Here is the answer to the question you have been carrying since the opening of this chapter. What education removed was not information. It was trust. Trust in your own reading of reality. Reclaim that trust, and every principle in this book becomes usable. Lose it, and no principle in any book will ever be enough. Because every wealth code, ancient or modern, only works in the hands of someone willing to act on what they already know. What will you do with that tomorrow morning, now that you know you were never missing the code? Chapter 14. You are the generation that recodes everything. There is a ritual that appears in every civilization that has ever accumulated and then lost its wealth. The details change. The names change. The tools change. But the structure repeats with an almost mechanical precision across centuries and cultures. A body of knowledge forms, a knowledge that allows ordinary people to build and hold and multiply what they earn. Then a concentrated power decides that particular knowledge is dangerous. And slowly, quietly, through the control of schools and syllabuses and what gets written and what gets burned, that knowledge is replaced with something safer, something that keeps people productive, compliant, and just comfortable enough not to ask hard questions. This is not paranoia. This is the oldest pattern in the history of human civilization. You have spent 13 chapters tracing exactly where that pattern left its marks on your own mind. You already know what was taken. The real question, the one this final chapter answers, is what you are supposed to do now that you have it back. That question from the end of the last chapter, what will you do with that tomorrow morning, is not rhetorical. It is the most important practical question in this entire book. But before you answer it, you need to understand something bigger than your own finances. What happened to you did not only happen to you. It happened to your parents. It happened to their parents before them. It runs back through your family line like a cut wire. Every generation has lived with the lights off, not knowing there was ever a switch. Think about the oldest person in your family who ever talked to you about money. Think about what they said. Think about the rules they gave you, the warnings, the phrases they repeated like prayers. Don't get above yourself. Money doesn't grow on trees. Rich people are just lucky. We're not that kind of family. Those weren't lies told out of cruelty. They were the honest transmission of everything that person had been given. And what they had been given was a map with the most important roads removed. That is the open wound here. Not that you were taught badly, that you were taught deliberately. The system that shaped your financial instincts was not broken. It was working exactly as designed. It was built to produce people who spend their working lives generating wealth for institutions, not for themselves. People who associate their labor with survival rather than with building. People who believe that investing is for a class of people they do not belong to, that ownership is complicated, that the principles behind wealth are technical rather than ancient and human, and available to anyone who learns to see them clearly. You were handed this, not by your family. By a structure your family also inherited without choosing it. Here is where hope enters, and it enters hard. The code still works. Everything this book has walked you through, the principles older than economics, the frameworks for value and exchange, and the compounding nature of chosen action, none of it aged out. None of it was disproven. It was removed. There is a critical difference between something that stopped working and something that was deliberately hidden. A broken tool cannot be fixed by finding it. A hidden tool can. You found it. Now comes the part most people miss. They hear something like this and they think about themselves. They think about their account balance, their next investment, the 5 moves they want to make in the next 2 years. And that thinking is good. It is right. It is exactly where you should start. But it is not where this ends. You are not just a person who recovered a principle. You are a link in a chain. And for the first time in however many generations your family has lived inside this manufactured blindness, you have the chance to be the link that doesn't pass the blindness forward. That is the revelation this final chapter is designed to land. Recovering the ancient wealth code is not just a personal act. It is the breaking of a deliberate generational chain. Every single time you apply what you have learned here, every time you choose to own rather than only earn, every time you make a decision based on value creation rather than wage fear, you are rewriting something that was written into your lineage without consent. You are not just building your own future. You are altering the inheritance you will leave behind. Think about a child in your life. Or imagine the child you may one day have. Think about what it would mean for that child to grow up in a house where the financial principles in this book are not hidden secrets but ordinary dinner table conversations, where the question is not whether wealth is possible but how it is built, where the map they burned has been redrawn by the very person who raised them. That child would start at a different position than you did, not because they were luckier, because you refused to pass the blindness forward. A woman named Dora grew up in a house where money was always a source of shame. Her father worked long hours and never had enough. Her mother kept the anxiety private, but it leaked through in small ways. The way she flinched at every unexpected bill. The way she made herself small at parent-teacher events when other parents talked about vacations. Dora absorbed all of it. By the time she was 28, she had her father's work ethic and her mother's fear. She could not figure out why she never seemed to make progress despite doing everything right. She earned more than either of her parents ever had. She had more information than they ever did. But the internal operating rules she was running on were the same. Spend to survive. Save what's left. Don't reach too far. One afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table with a notebook and something her older sister had told her about the way money compounds when it is put to work, something shifted in Dora. Not loudly, quietly. She wrote one sentence at the top of the page. This stops with me. She did not mean debt. She did not mean poverty. She meant the belief system, the inherited blindness. 3 years later, she had made 3 small investments, each one unremarkable on its own, each one a declaration that she was operating by different rules. Her daughter is 7. She already knows what compound interest is. She already knows that money can work while you sleep. She will not spend 30 years unlearning what Dora spent 30 years absorbing. That is what you are holding right now. The map they burned, and this is the last time you will hear that phrase in this book, so let it land. The map they burned still exists. It always existed. It was not made of paper. It was made of principles, and principles cannot be burned. They can only be forgotten, and forgetting requires cooperation across generations. That cooperation required that no one in your line ever had exactly what you have right now, the recovered understanding of what was taken and why. You are the generation that recodes everything, not because you are special in some inherited way, because you are the first one who stopped cooperating with the forgetting. This is the mirror moment, and it is the last one. Put the headphones down if you need to. Or just let the question sit inside the sound of this. Who did you used to believe you were in the story of wealth? Not who you were told to be. Who you quietly believed you were in the moments when no one was watching. That belief was not yours. It was handed to you. The fact that you have listened this far through 14 chapters, through every principle and parable and moment of uncomfortable recognition, means you already know it no longer fits. You are not a person waiting for permission to build. You are not a person on the outside of some exclusive knowledge. You are the living proof that the code survives everything they threw at it, because here it is, inside you, intact, operational, older than any institution that tried to bury it. Do not wait for the right moment. Do not wait until the account balance looks like it justifies the belief. The belief comes first. It always came first. That is the principle this entire book has been circling from page 1. They burned the map. You are the map maker now.